the South. It's home to the first permanent English settlement in America, 4 of the original 13 colonies, and many legendary tales. It was here where 117 early settlers disappeared without a trace. A pirate named Blackbeard met his grisly fate, and 2 brothers first took to the air in the birthplace of flight. But the South is famous for its epic conflicts, too. It was here that Native Americans were taken from their land and forced into exile on a trail of tears. It was in fields of cotton that millions of enslaved Africans labored for centuries in the hot southern sun. All across the South, thousands of Civil War soldiers perished during the bloodiest conflict in American history. And it was in a small county courthouse that a jury acquitted 2 white men who were guilty of one of the nation's most horrific crimes. But the people of the South have always fought to overcome the odds. It was here that a Georgia preacher inspired millions in the battle for civil rights, where a dazzling city rose again on the ashes of war and is now a hip-hop capital of the nation in a region also known as the heart of country music. It's not hard to understand why Southerners feel such a deep connection to their land. When you peer down on their stunning Gulf shores, soar across rivers that make you feel like you've entered an enchanted world, and climb to the top of high, rocky peaks that tower over one of the most fascinating regions in America, the South. The South is a place of many stories, but there's none as strange as the one that unfolded here, just inside North Carolina's Outer Banks, at a place called Roanoke Island. It remains one of the greatest mysteries of the American South. In 1585, 107 English settlers were dropped off on this coast with a mission to establish England's first permanent settlement in America. A replica of the kind of ship they arrived on is now docked close to where they made their historic landing. But after they arrived, the men clashed with Native Americans and started running out of supplies. They were forced to flee back to England just 1 year later. In 1587, an even larger group of 117 men, women, and children tried again to make a go at settling Roanoke Island. And that's when the mystery started. Three years later, when a supply ship arrived here, those on board made a chilling discovery. The Roanoke settlers had completely vanished. All that remained was an earthwork fort that still stands here in the trees, not far from the shore. They also discovered that someone had carved the word Croatoan into a wooden post, but they had no idea why. Artifacts from this and other early settlement sites in the region have suggested that some of the survivors might have joined Native American communities in order to survive. Why they didn't return to leave messages for those who might look for them remains a mystery that has never been solved. After the Roanoke colony's disappearance, the English weren't able to settle the South for another 20 years, until May 1607, when 3 more ships arrived off the coast of what's now Virginia. Those vessels, named Susan Constant, Godspeed, and Discovery, carried 144 boys and men. They chose a settlement site far upriver for protection and named it Jamestown, after their king. But Native Americans attacked the settlers almost as soon as they arrived, and so they built a triangular-shaped fort, which is now outlined with a wooden fence. The biggest threats to settlers at Jamestown ended up being dysentery, salt poisoning, typhoid, and famine. Within 5 months, half of them were dead, most from starvation. That period of the Jamestown colony came to be known as the Starving Time. But enough settlers survived to make Jamestown the first permanent English settlement in America, founded more than a decade before the Pilgrims made their famous landing in Plymouth. At the time, Eastern Virginia was home to at least 13,000 Native Americans. They lived up and down the surrounding coast in simple huts, similar to these replicas in historic Jamestown. The tribes here were all ruled by a single chief named Powhatan. Without his offerings of food, many more of the Jamestown settlers would likely have starved. But when those settlers then started to demand more food and raided Indian villages to get it, conflicts with the Indians flared. They captured Powhatan's favorite daughter, Pocahontas, and used her as a bargaining chip to force the chief to return English prisoners and weapons. She ended up marrying one of the members of the colony, John Rolfe, but died in England a few years later when she was only about 21 years old. Jamestown is not only important as the first permanent English settlement in America, it was also here where the unique economy, plantation culture, and slave history of the American South were born, thanks to a wide leafy plant called tobacco. At the time, King James I himself believed tobacco was loathsome to the eye, harmful to the brain, and dangerous to the lungs. But since worldwide demand for tobacco was on the rise, he founded the Shirley Plantation here in Charles City, Virginia in 1613 and helped make tobacco Virginia's biggest cash crop and #1 export. It also proved to English investors that fortunes could be made from southern plantations if they could find the labor to grow the crops. It was in 1640 that the Shirley Plantation and others began to embrace slavery as a path to profit. Because of tobacco and the cheap labor of enslaved African men and women, the Southern Plantation was born. Today, 4 centuries later, tobacco still plays a big role in the economy of the South, especially in North Carolina, where it remains the state's top crop. Starting in the 1880s, the city of Durham became the heart of the cigarette industry. Its hometown baseball team was even called the Tobacconists, until it was renamed the Durham Bulls after a leading cigarette brand. The snorting bull sign that towers over the field is a copy of the one featured in the 1988 Kevin Costner hit movie Bull Durham, in which Costner plays a talented catcher. In 1924, Durham's Trinity College was renamed Duke University after its largest benefactor, the Duke family, major shareholders of the American Tobacco Company. Today, this campus is considered one of the top universities in the nation. It's also home to one of the hottest rivalries in American sports. It's here in the Cameron Indoor Stadium that Duke's Blue Devils basketball team face off every year against the University of North Carolina's Tar Heels, just as they've been doing since 1920. Both teams have 5 NCAA championship wins, but in their regular season play, the Tar Heels have won more than half the games they've played against the Blue Devils. One reason that the Carolina-Duke rivalry is so fierce is because UNC lies just down the road in nearby Chapel Hill. It was here in UNC's Carmichael Auditorium that a young Michael Jordan played for the Tar Heels in 1981 on a basketball scholarship. During that first season, he was named Freshman Player of the Year and helped lead the Tar Heels to an NCAA championship win. Jordan's mentor was UNC's coaching legend, Dean Smith. But Jordan left UNC in 1984 after he was drafted by the Chicago Bulls. before he'd even graduated. UNC is part of what's known as the Research Triangle, a region shaped by 3 universities, UNC in Chapel Hill, Duke in Durham, and North Carolina State in nearby Raleigh. At its heart is Research Triangle Park, a vast campus that's home to many of the top high-tech companies in the world. From lighting giant Cree, the leader in LED light bulbs, to German chemical company BASF, which uses its greenhouses here to develop genetically modified crops like corn. Research Triangle Park was started in 1959 to try and keep talented scientists and engineers from leaving the South for jobs in Northeast cities like New York and Boston. It's part of what now drives the growing high-tech economy of the South and what's caused more Americans to migrate here than to any other region of the country. Fly across the southern United States, and it can seem like there's no end to the rich geographic diversity of the South. But there are just as many different ways that people here define what it means to them to be a Southerner. For many, it's a close connection to the land that dates back generations, or the experience of living close to the ever-shifting Mississippi River. For others, it's keeping the ancient traditions of their ancestors alive. Or perhaps just the pleasure of fishing on a favorite river. In the end, most Southerners would probably agree that being a Southerner is really just a state of mind. Especially since there's no one way to define the South as a region. For the United States Census Bureau, the South is a geographic region that covers 16 states, stretching from Delaware in the Northeast all the way down to Florida and west to Texas and Oklahoma. But some historians exclude Oklahoma and include Missouri in their maps of the South, since they treat the region as the 15 states where slavery was practiced prior to the Civil War. Today, most people think of the South as the 11 states that seceded from the Union, a region also referred to simply as Dixie. But there are also many possible subdivisions within the southern states. Places where cotton was once king, like Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi, and Louisiana, are often called the Deep South. The states that line the Gulf of Mexico, including Texas, are sometimes called the Gulf South. And then there are the South Atlantic states that run down the Atlantic coast from Delaware to Florida. It's along this coast that lies a series of long, narrow barrier islands known as North Carolina's Outer Banks. They were created by receding glaciers roughly 18,000 years ago. Today, they are home to the first national seashore in the nation. The 30,000-acre Cape Hatteras National Seashore has been open to the public since 1953. But the peaceful beauty of the Outer Banks belies the dangers that lurk just offshore. The waters off this coast have been called the graveyard of the Atlantic due to a treacherous sandbar known as Diamond Shoals that extends more than 9 miles out to sea. The shoals and powerful currents are believed to have sunk more than 1,000 vessels here over the years. But in the 1700s, pirates, not sandbars, were what many sailors along this coast feared the most, especially one named Blackbeard. Just south of Cape Hatteras Island lies the Ocracoke Inlet. It provides a way for ships to pass through the barrier islands into Pamlico Sound. In the 18th century, this was one of the busiest waterways in the South. It's why one of America's most notorious outlaws, a pirate named Blackbeard, is said to have hid out just inside the Ocracoke Inlet to plunder ships that passed by. For 18th century sailors, one of the most terrifying sights on the horizon was a ship full of buccaneers. Today, a 2/3 scaled replica of a 17th century pirate ship still plies these very same waters. After pulling up alongside the vessels he wanted to raid, Blackbeard and his fellow pirates often fired on them with cannons before leaping on board. There was a good reason that Blackbeard knew these waters well. He is said to have received protection from North Carolina's governor for a share of the treasure from his raids. Both men lived here in the nearby town of Bath on the Pamlico River. Blackbeard's house is said to have stood at a spot called Plum Point, a perfect place to keep an eye out for pirate hunters. Hunters like the one that finally captured Blackbeard, right here in North Carolina. It was just off the shores of Ocracoke Island in 1718 that a Royal Navy captain killed the legendary pirate after luring him into an ambush. Then he cut off his head, mounted it to the bow of the ship, and dumped the rest of his body into Pamlico Sound. The legend goes that Blackbeard's ghost still roams Ocracoke Island, searching for his long-lost head. Right up until the end of the 19th century, the barrier islands of southern states like North Carolina were pretty much uninhabited. There was little here but sand, wind, and wide open skies. And that's exactly why the South came to be home to the birthplace of flight. In 1900, two bicycle shop owners from Dayton, Ohio, named Wilbur and Orville Wright, came to North Carolina's windy coast to learn to fly. They returned every year to launch their gliders off the top of a giant sand dune called Big Kill Devil Hill, as they tried to come up with a design for an engine-powered airplane. They tinkered in simple wooden sheds, which have since been reconstructed. They were finally prepared to test their new engine-powered aircraft in the winter of 1903. On December 17th, they slid their invention out of the hangar on its skids, since it didn't have wheels. After a coin toss, Orville buckled himself into the pilot's seat. The engine started, and he and the flyer edged forward. 27-mile-per-hour headwinds helped give them lift. And then, amazingly, they were airborne. For 12 incredible seconds, Orville kept the Wright flyer aloft for a distance of 120 feet to the place where this #1 marker now stands. By the time he touched down, the Wright brothers had made history. It was the first time that an engine-powered flying machine, heavier than air, had succeeded in a sustained and controlled flight. That same day, the Wright brothers took turns at the controls and flew greater and greater distances, each of which is marked by a different stone block at the base of Big Kill Devil Hill. In the fourth and last of those flights, it was Wilbur who flew the furthest, landing 852 feet away from where he had lifted off. Today, a towering 60-foot-high monument to the Wright brothers stands tall here as a celebration of their conquest of the air. The Wright brothers went on to refine and market their airplane. It was sold as the Wright Bee Flyer, replicas of which still take to the skies today. Their original flyer was made from wood. This one is made out of steel, but is a nearly exact copy of the Wright Bee Flyer that was once the first commercially produced airplane in the world. The American South was the birthplace of flight. Today, it's a major hub for America's modern aviation industry. This is Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport. In 2014, it was the busiest airport in the world. 96 million passengers arrived and departed from here in just 1 year. It's part of the transformation of the South over the last century, from a region once dominated by agriculture to one now driven by industry. Here at the Port of Charleston, BMWs are perfectly lined up and ready for export. These X5 models were all manufactured in nearby Greer, South Carolina, and will be shipped out from Charleston to 140 countries around the world. BMW is just one of a number of car companies that have recently set up shop in the South. Mercedes-Benz now produces close to 200,000 cars a year here at its plant in Tuscaloosa, Alabama. While in nearby Mississippi, Nissan has already built more than 3 million cars to be sold all across the country. These car makers have helped turn the South into the fastest growing industrialized region of the nation. They've also fueled a wide range of other major industries, like this vast new steel plant in southern Alabama. It was originally built by the German company ThyssenKrupp at a cost of nearly $5 billion. Its unique look was created by a German color designer who wanted the plant to harmonize with the landscape instead of looking like a giant industrial eyesore. Color, he insisted, should be music for the eye. Today, the economies of many southern states have been transformed by the arrival of new industries, just as many southern cities have been by the creation of modern engineering marvels. Soar across Charleston, South Carolina, and you discover one of the modern wonders of the South, the Arthur Ravenel Jr. Bridge, which spans the Cooper River. Today, highways leap across southern waterways, but once the rivers themselves served as key transportation routes, they are how English colonists and plantation owners got their crops to market. Southern plantations like this one, called Boone Hall outside Charleston, were often built next to rivers. They even had their own docks and waterside warehouses. Waterways helped fuel the explosion of the plantation economy, which grew rapidly after the arrival of the Jamestown settlers in the early 17th century and spurred other English investors to found other colonies in the American South. By 1712, there were 4 British colonies in the American South: Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, and South Carolina. In 1733, King George II granted a charter for a new colony called Georgia that would act as a buffer between South Carolina and Florida, which was under Spanish control. Soon after, 120 hopeful settlers arrived here on the banks of the Savannah River to settle the last of Britain's 13 American colonies. Their leader, an English general named James Oglethorpe, quickly made friends with a local Indian chief named Tomochichi, who granted him the land that would ultimately become one of the jewels of the South, the city of Savannah. Oglethorpe had great visions for the new settlement, and he carefully laid out Savannah as a grid, with residential and commercial blocks built around city squares and parks. It's what made Savannah the very green city it is today. During the Civil War, Union General William Tecumseh Sherman burned Atlanta to the ground, but decided that Savannah would be spared. He sent a message to President Lincoln telling him, "I beg to present you as a Christmas gift the city of Savannah." One reason there are so many steeples in Savannah is because the original plan made space for churches close to every city square. One of those owes its origins to a freed African-American slave named George Lyle. In 1773, he was given a license to preach in the slave quarters of the plantations that lined the Savannah River. His congregation was the start of the first Black Baptist church in America. In the 1850s, enslaved Africans funded the building of Savannah's first African Baptist church. With savings, many of them could have used instead to gain their own individual freedom. Today, old cotton warehouses still line the waterfront of this southern city. They date from a time when Savannah was one of the biggest exporters of cotton in the world. The settlement of Georgia was like that of the other British colonies in the South. They started out in port cities like Savannah, and then expanded westward as wealthy investors cleared the land to create their vast plantations, and poorer settlers carved out their own small farms on the mountainous frontier. it's still possible to imagine what vast stretches of the American South were like before Europeans arrived. When you soar across the Cherokee National Forest on North Carolina's border with Tennessee. For thousands of years, these mountains were home to the Cherokee, but they were just a small piece of their vast nation, which covered 40,000 square miles here in the Appalachian Mountains. In 1819, as more and more Americans started encroaching on Indian land, the U.S. government signed a treaty that guaranteed that Cherokee land would be off limits to white settlers forever. It clearly stated, all white people who have intruded or may hereafter intrude on the lands reserved for the Cherokees shall be removed by the United States. Confident that the U.S. government now recognized its sovereignty over its own lands, the Cherokee Nation proceeded to build itself a new capital in 1825, here in what's known as New Echota, Georgia. It had its own courthouse, council house, and post office, and even space for the first Indian language newspaper office in the nation. The buildings that stand here today are reconstructions of the originals, because within just a few years, there were no Cherokee left here. In 1828, just 3 years after the Cherokee capital was built, white trespassers discovered gold in the rivers of what's now Lumpkin County, Georgia. When word got out, thousands of hopeful prospectors began flooding onto Cherokee land to search for treasure, and the U.S. government did nothing to stop them, despite the promises it had made in its treaties. The government even built a brand new U.S. Mint here in the middle of the town of Dahlonega, which turned it into a boom town. Today, the administration building of the University of North Georgia stands on the site of the former mint, with a spire covered in gold leaf as a reminder of this town's gold rush history. In 1829, the same year that gold was discovered, Andrew Jackson was elected U.S. president. He believed that Native Americans were savages and had no rights to their land, and began proceedings to remove the Cherokee from the southern states to clear the way for white settlement. The next year, he signed the 1830 Indian Removal Act, which set in motion one of the most brutal actions ever taken by the U.S. government. Thousands of Native Americans were pulled from their homes in Georgia and other states across the South. Many were shackled in chains and forced to walk at gunpoint more than 1,000 miles west on a series of routes that all led to Oklahoma. Up to a third of the 15,000 Cherokee who were forced to make the journey died on the way, which is one reason that journey came to be known as the Trail of Tears. In September 1836, a leading member of the Cherokee Nation, John Ross, wrote to the U.S. Congress to protest the removals. We are stripped of every attribute of freedom. Our property may be plundered before our eyes. We have neither land nor home, nor resting place that can be called our own. Our hearts are sickened. By the time this forced resettlement was over, 25 million acres of land that had belonged to the Cherokee and other tribes, including the Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Seminole nations, was now opened up for white settlement. But some Cherokee had hidden in the forests to escape the U.S. forces. Others fled once they had reached Oklahoma and returned here to the lands where their ancestors were buried. Their descendants are known today as the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians and live here on sovereign Indian land in Cherokee, North Carolina. Today, young Cherokee here at the local high school learn the language of their forebears. A vast stretch of their tribe's former land, right next to town, is now the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, the most visited national park in the nation. In the years that followed the Indian Removal Act, the economy of the South boomed, thanks in large part to the success of one crop called King Cotton, for which many Southerners would soon be willing to go to war. By the mid-1800s, Southern plantations, which depended on the labor of enslaved Africans, had made the United States the biggest cotton producer in the world. One historian from the time wrote that cotton was the foundation of the Southern economy, while slavery was its cornerstone. So when Abraham Lincoln was elected president on November 6, 1860, and promised to outlaw slavery, many in the South saw it as a direct assault on their economy and feared it would bring an end to their centuries-old agrarian way of life. On December 24, 1860, lawmakers here in Columbia, the South Carolina state capital, voted unanimously for South Carolina to secede from the federal union. Within weeks, Georgia, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Louisiana, and Texas also seceded. They signed a new constitution that made clear that owning slaves would remain a legal right in the states of their new confederacy. When South Carolina seceded, Union troops were in command of Fort Moultrie, guarding the entrance of Charleston Harbor. But the Union commander, Major Robert Anderson, feared he and his men would now come under attack by the secessionists. So they lowered their stars and stripes and moved to Fort Sumter, which lies on an island in the middle of Charleston Harbor. Anderson had thought its thick walls would provide better protection, but he was soon cut off by Confederate forces. 4 months later, Anderson and his men were nearly out of food, but they refused a final demand to surrender. On April 12th at 4:30 a.m., the Confederates lay siege to Fort Sumter. They were the first shots fired of the Civil War. The terrifying barrage continued for 34 hours. According to one of the Union soldiers, walls fell, fires burned, and pandemonium raged. But amazingly, no Union soldiers died in the assault. On April 13th, 1 day later, Anderson finally did surrender. His men lowered their now tattered stars and stripes and retreated to the safety of Union ships offshore. Soon after the Battle of Fort Sumter, 4 more states seceded from the Union: Virginia, Tennessee, Arkansas, and North Carolina. In May 1861, the new Confederate government decided to make Richmond, Virginia, its new capital, which it remained throughout the war. The President of the Confederate States, Jefferson Davis, soon took up residence in this former private home downtown that was given the name the White House of the Confederacy. Richmond was chosen as the site for the Confederate capital because Virginia was the most populated and most industrialized state in the South at the time. It was able to provide the weapons that the Confederate Army needed, thanks to the Tredegar Iron Works, whose buildings still stand here on the banks of the James River. This foundry would become the biggest supplier of artillery to the Confederate Army. Almost 1,100 cannons would be forged here and shipped out to defend the Confederate forces from Union attacks. The first of those attacks took place right here in Virginia, just south of Washington, D.C. On July 16, 1861, 35,000 volunteers and other troops set out from Washington to try and seize Richmond. Little did they know that they would soon be fighting for their lives. The Battle of Bull Run, also called the Battle of First Manassas, was named after the Bull Run Creek that winds through Manassas, Virginia. It was around this creek that the Confederate Army had gathered to stop the Union advance. But the fighting that followed came to a head here, at this hill surrounding Henry House. The Southerners quickly overpowered the Federal troops and forced them into retreat. The Battle of First Manassas was the first evidence of the toll the war would take on civilians caught in the middle. As the two armies had fought for control of Henry Hill, an aging woman named Judith Henry lay bedridden inside her family home. After Confederate snipers took up positions inside the farmhouse, a Union cannon shell ripped it to pieces and injured Judith Henry so badly that she soon died in her daughter's arms. She was the first civilian casualty of the war. Historians still don't know exactly how many civilians died during the Civil War, but a recent study has found that as many as 750,000 soldiers may have lost their lives, which is more Americans than have died in all other conflicts in U.S. history combined. Thousands perished from gunfire and hand-to-hand combat at the Battle of Resaca in Georgia in 1864, which is reenacted every year. But the majority of all Civil War fatalities didn't happen on the battlefield. Wounded soldiers often perished from simple injuries and infections they incurred in battle, for which there were not yet cures. And then there were the thousands more who died at a place called Andersonville. This piece of ground in Georgia was not a battlefield, but was the site of some of the war's most horrific suffering. By 1863, the Confederate Army had captured so many Union soldiers, it was running out of space to hold them. So, they built this 26.5-acre stockade in a remote part of Georgia that was not likely to be raided by the Union Army. It was named for the nearby village of Andersonville, located on a major rail line, which was used to transport thousands of captured Union soldiers to the nearby camp. The stockade was designed for 10,000 prisoners, but soon there were more than 30,000 inside its walls. Due to severe overcrowding, diseases spread like wildfire. Food was scarce. Every day, more prisoners arrived through its gates. One Union soldier later wrote, "As we entered the place, a spectacle met our eyes that almost froze our blood with horror. Stalwart men, now nothing but mere walking skeletons, covered with filth and vermin." 15-foot-high walls surrounded the entire camp. Prisoners who got too close to the perimeter were shot dead. Without adequate shelter, the men here built their own lean-tos, teepees, huts, and even dug holes in the ground for protection, with whatever they could find. In the hot Georgia summer sun, some of the parched Union prisoners got down on their knees and started praying for water. Not long afterwards, water suddenly appeared from a spring inside the walls of the camp. Convinced that their prayers had been answered, prisoners named the source Providence Spring. Today, water from that same spring still flows through Andersonville. But while Providence Spring may have provided hope to men in the camp, it didn't save the lives of the nearly 13,000 soldiers who died here, many from untreated injuries incurred during battle. Their naked bodies, up to 100 a day, were carted off in wagons across the fields of Andersonville and buried in shallow trenches. When the camp was finally liberated in May 1865, many of the prisoners were little more than skin and bones. After the war was over, the commandant of Andersonville, Major Henry Wirtz, was convicted of war crimes and hanged. Monuments now stand on the site in memory of the dead of the different Union states. Andersonville's graveyard is now a national cemetery to honor those who perished in what was the worst prisoner of war camp on either side of the Civil War. By the time the war ended, much of the South was in ruins. Entire cities had been burned to the ground or heavily damaged. Farms abandoned. And basic infrastructure like bridges and rail lines destroyed. All this devastation had brought an end to slavery in America. It also brought hope to millions of former slaves in the South who were now free. In the period that followed, known as Reconstruction, amendments to the U.S. Constitution guaranteed African Americans citizenship, equality, and the right to vote. But many whites in the South refused to accept blacks as equals. Their efforts would force African Americans to spend more than a century fighting to secure their most basic freedoms. Fly across the South today, and you can still discover the places that were key turning points in that struggle. It was here at Stone Mountain in Georgia, now famous for its massive and controversial Confederate memorial, that the white supremacist organization, the Ku Klux Klan, gathered in 1915 to declare its rebirth by burning a cross on the summit. In the years that followed, millions of Southerners and others joined the Klan, which waged campaigns of terror against African Americans. The Klan's goal was to destroy what it called the rising tide of color in America. African Americans were threatened with intimidation and violence all across the South, from major cities to small towns. Towns like this one, known as Money, Mississippi. Drive through Money today, and it would be easy to pass right by this now abandoned corner store, which is a key site in the history of the Civil Rights Movement. In 1955, a 14-year-old African-American boy named Emmett Till came to the store to buy bubble gum with his friends, but was then accused of trying to flirt with the store owner's wife as he left. A few nights later, young Emmett was kidnapped at gunpoint, brutally beaten, and then shot to death. His battered and disfigured body thrown into the Tallahatchie River. Two white men, Roy Bryant and J.W. Milam, were acquitted of the crime by an all-male, all-white jury here at the Tallahatchie County Courthouse. Later, after being paid $4,000 for their story by a magazine, they admitted and even boasted of how they had carried out the killing. But they were never called to account for the murder. The constant threat of violence and the enforcement of discriminatory Jim Crow laws did not succeed in stopping African Americans from organizing to fight for their rights. Almost 100 days after Till's death, in downtown Montgomery, Alabama, a 42-year-old seamstress named Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on a bus to a white man. Her arrest in 1955 inspired the famous and successful Montgomery bus boycott, a major turning point in the Civil Rights Movement. And it was here, in Selma, Alabama in 1965, that a wave of civil rights protests came to a head on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. On that day, 600 African Americans had begun to march to the state capitol in Montgomery to try and secure their right to vote. But as they started to cross the bridge, state and local police savagely attacked the marchers with tear gas, billy clubs, and bullwhips. Just 2 weeks later, a young Martin Luther King Jr. led another much larger march to Montgomery and declared upon his arrival here at the State House, "All the world today knows that we are here, and we are standing before the forces of power in the state of Alabama saying, we ain't gonna let nobody turn us around." It was those marches and speeches that pushed President Lyndon B. Johnson to sign the landmark 1965 Voting Rights Act into law. The trail of the Civil Rights Movement winds its way all across the South. But for many, there's no place on this trail as powerful as a neighborhood in Atlanta, Georgia known as Sweet Auburn. It was in this simple brown and yellow house that Martin Luther King Jr. was born on January 15, 1929, in an upstairs room. King learned to preach just down the street at the Ebenezer Baptist Church, where his father, Martin Luther King Sr., was pastor. He delivered his first sermon inside the church in 1947, and was still a co-pastor here when he was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee in 1968. Today, the Ebenezer Church is part of the larger Martin Luther King Jr. National Historic Site. It's here where the civil rights leader and his wife, Coretta Scott King, are buried together in a crypt which is engraved with the words, "Free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, I'm free at last." Martin Luther King Jr. lived to see the beginning of the great transformation of his hometown of Atlanta into a city that many now call the capital of the South. The modern city that stands here today ultimately rose from the ashes of the Civil War. During the war, Atlanta served as a key railway hub for Confederate troops and supplies, which is why it was burned to the ground by the Union Army. After the war, it was also the railway that fueled the city's recovery. Every day, trains arrived, carrying unemployed workers from across the southern states. Atlanta was hailed as the heart of what boosters called the New South, which they hoped would be driven primarily by industry, not agriculture. But while Atlanta boomed, segregation and Jim Crow laws drove many African Americans away for better opportunities in the industrial boomtowns of the North, like Detroit and Chicago, during what's known as the Great Migration. But in 1973, just 5 years after Martin Luther King Jr.'s death, Atlanta voted in its first black mayor, Maynard Jackson, who was the great-grandson of slaves. During Jackson's 3 terms in office, talented and aspiring African Americans flocked to Atlanta, where they now believed anything was possible. In 1980, Ted Turner boosted Atlanta's prestige when he created the world's first 24-hour news channel, CNN. And in 1996, Atlanta was the proud host of the Summer Olympics. But even though corporate towers define its skyline, it also has one of the most attractive alternative art and theater scenes of any southern city. Much of it is centered here, in the Little Five Points district, east of town. Atlanta has also become a capital of hip-hop. It was at a Tri-Cities high school outside town where 2 students, best known by their stage names, Big Boy and Andre 3000, first met and teamed up to create the hip-hop duo Outkast. Their Stankonia Studios, here on the north side of town, has lured hip-hop talent from across the nation, as well as other major Atlanta musicians, including Killer Mike, Ludacris, and Usher. Atlanta is just one place where the people of the South have carved out unique identities and proven that there's no single definition of what it means to be a Southerner. And that's also the case here in the Music City, Nashville, Tennessee. In the 1800s, Nashville, here on the banks of the Cumberland River, was known as a center for music publishing, but it didn't become Music City until November 28, 1925, when the Grand Ole Opry debuted its weekly radio show. It was initially called the WSM Barn Dance, after the station's name. In 1943, the wildly popular country and western broadcast moved to the city's Ryman Auditorium, a venue that's been called the Mother Church of country music. Thanks to the Grand Ole Opry, many famous country stars got their start in Nashville, including Dolly Parton, Hank Williams Sr., Loretta Lynn, and Earl Scruggs. Many other musicians have flocked here ever since, hoping to get their big break, while music lovers come to hear the latest talent. Bars and clubs crowd Music Row, which remains the heart of Nashville's music scene. But the city hasn't just been a place for live performance. It's also the home to one of the nation's most legendary recording studios. In the 1960s, RCA Victor Records built a new studio here, a few blocks away from Music Row, to take advantage of all the talent passing through Nashville. Called Studio B, it was managed by country music great Chet Atkins, who recorded everyone from Elvis Presley to the Everly Brothers. This legendary studio is now owned by Nashville's Country Music Hall of Fame, which stands nearby, with windows designed to look like piano keys. Music is just one of the many ways that people in the South express their southernness and have responded to the great changes that have swept across their land. From the days when America was first founded, to battles of the Civil War and victories for civil rights, it's a region rich with the history of the nation, where freedom still beckons and many come to reach for the sky. There's simply no other place like the American South.